the 18th Annual Addiction and Recovery Lecture Series. My sobriety date is September 15th, 2005. It's an honor to be here on stage tonight and not in less honorable places. This year's event will be the last. After 31 years teaching college physics, I'll be retiring at the end of June. When I do, the series goes with me. I'll always be grateful for the opportunities this college has provided for me, which was really much more than I deserve. Of course, if I'd gotten what I deserved, again, it would be a much less honorable place for me. Before I forget, I'd like to remind you that there are 2 more Thursdays to come in the series. It's not just tonight, there's 2 more Thursdays. So there's next Thursday, February 20th, for Dr. Kevin McCauley from the Meadows Institute in Arizona. And some of you have experienced Dr. McCauley before. Dr. McCauley will speak on process addictions of gambling, which is pretty relevant this year with online gambling being legal in some states, sex addiction, internet, and cell phone addictions. So it should be a very interesting week next week. On Thursday, February 27th, to close the series, I will speak 1 hour on the 18-year history of the series. Every year, there's going to be a little blurb about each speaker and some nuances that you might not have known about each year. And the last hour of the last night of the last series, I'll finish it with my own story of addiction and recovery. Hope you can make it. Food will again be included. To start tonight, let's have a moment of silence for the still sick and suffering alcoholics and drug addicts that won't hear this message of recovery, and the families that will suffer, followed by the we version of the Serenity Prayer. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, courage to change the things we can, the wisdom to know the difference. There's some housekeeping before we start. I'd like to thank Rebecca Kanawa for her help with the food. If you ate tonight, give her a round of applause. Thank you, Rebecca. That was invaluable. She organized the whole food part of it. Special thanks to the CFAC committee at the college. In the beginning, all speakers came from Horry County. In fact, some of them are here tonight, I believe. But no speaker outside of Horry County would have ever come here without the CFAC committee. So again, the CFAC committee was essential. Series would not have existed without their support in the beginning. Thanks to the volunteers who handed out the programs. Thanks to the school print shop for their help in designing and redesigning the programs at the last minutes. The IT department for their help with logistics. There's so many more. There's so many people to thank. I can't thank you all. I can't name you all, but I do thank you all. There are a few special people here tonight who have come in from very far away places. These people were here at the very first lecture series in 2005, and many of the other ones that followed. Over the years, their education took them to other places, but tonight they have come back one last time for this final series. When I call your name, please raise your hand. From Chicago, Dr. Sam King. From Augusta, Georgia, Mrs. Kinsey King. From Charlotte, North Carolina, Mrs. Katie Lorenzen. The topic of that first series was life in the universe, and you guys were here in the beginning. You were 10, 10, and 14 years old, but you came with me on that first series. And it must have been successful because it's 20 years later and you're still here. So I think it was a great series. And you know more about recovery than most people twice your age. I'm proud of each of you. In 2009, our family doubled. Bonus kids, Shelby and Daniel, raise your hand. All right. Shelby comes in from Charleston for this series and is moving to California. Dan is still in the Myrtle Beach area and is our go-to guy when we need help. Thank you. These 5 guys are your quality assurance for this program. You may not know this, but this is how I get my speaker. The first thing I do is I get the idea, and then I'll ask one or all 5 of those guys, do you know this person? Or what do you know about this person? And I don't follow Reddit. but they do. So they have all this inside information that, no, you don't want that person because there's a lawsuit about them or something like that. So they have saved you guys from so many inappropriate speakers. So thank you. Thank you, guys. And then special thanks to my wife, Jennifer. Raise your hand, Jennifer. She has put up with rantings and ravings, and she has said that. That's the words that she used. Do you know Danny Trejo? What do you think about Danny Trejo? Do you think people would like Danny Trejo? Over and over and over. That's the whole process. They get the idea, and they're the sounding board. So you can thank them. And yes, they approved tonight's speaker. They did. So you were the first ones I asked. Chef Zimmerman is a TV and radio personality, food critic, writer, and more. You're probably most familiar with him from Bizarre Foods from Travel Network. 13 seasons, 137 episodes. Although there's more to him than just that. It was just probably his widest swath through society at earliest part in his life. With 33 years of sobriety, Andrew works a program of recovery that allows him today to live the life he was intended to live instead of the life his addiction forced him to live. Listening to his story, even I related, from sipping his father's drinks, which is how I got started, to extensive periods of time being left alone, which is what happened to me. The similarities were many. As a young teenager, there were events that caused Andrew to feel isolated and ashamed. Discovering drugs and alcohol were a solution, these habits continued into Andrew's adulthood. While running restaurants in New York City, Andrew began stealing from friends and family until he could no longer do that. Eventually, he lost his job, became homeless. In 1992, there was a suicide attempt. After decades of drug abuse and emotional isolation, Zimmerman called a friend and asked for help. With the encouragement of his friends, he found a rehab center, enrolled in the 12-step program, and he became a giver instead of a taker. His outlook changed, his career took off. He went from cooking in restaurants to hosting his own TV and radio shows. Now he's got an Emmy, 4 James Beard Awards. Andrew is still grateful for the moment of clarity that changed his life. Tonight, he's been asked to share his story with you. Remember to relate, not compare, but really there's no comparison to Andrew Zimmerman. Please welcome him to stage.
How's everyone doing? Good. I'm doing pretty good too. I am so honored to be here. I want to give a huge shout out to Casey and to everyone who, and I'm sure it was quite a large group, who have anything to do with me being here today. I really am grateful. And I've been really sort of obsessing about it for the last 3 or 4 hours since I found out when I walked in at 3:30 and met him for the first time that this is the final, story in a lengthy series. And I sort of, thought to myself, I've not attended any, haven't been to a one. What does it mean for me to be here? It's a tremendous source of pride. It's a really cool club of people. But most importantly, to be a part of a ripple in a pond that goes out and affects so many other people in a community that I feel a great kinship with, is a real source of joy for me. So thank you for that gift, and thank you for asking me to be here. I really, really, truly appreciate it. I do a lot of speaking professionally about all kinds of different things. I have a pretty insane resume. I'm a workaholic, not in a healthy way. I should do less. I would be better off. But as hard as I've worked on it for the last 33 years, I haven't been able to shake this idea that I lost 12, 14 years of my life to this disease, and that I'm still trying to make up for it, right? Just, it is what it is. I also use work like a drug. If I want to avoid something or not pay attention to something in my life that's uncomfortable, 99% of the time you will find me working rather than dealing with it. I will use that as an excuse. But there is a lot of joy that I take from my work, and a lot of things that I do for the United Nations, for the International Rescue Committee, for the Environmental Working Group, for many NGOs and nonprofits that absolutely thrill me to death. There is no place that I would rather be than in Zambia, putting a pilot program to feed school kids into the Mugombe School District. One of the great joys of my life. And I realized that if I kind of look back at everything that sort of happened to me in recovery, when I think about the intersection of my public and my private life, because I do have a very public piece of what I do. Bizarre Foods was the first TV show that had my name on it. For some reason, like 25 years ago, they started naming, your name had to be in it. Bizarre Foods with Andrew Zimmern. It's an awful habit the team couldn't just be Bizarre Foods and then I show up. I would have actually been much happier. You put your name on something, everyone expects you to show up in a certain way. That's why a lot of chefs don't put their names on their restaurants and others do. It's just a point of view about it. But I have this public and I have this private life, and I've tried to have them have as smooth a transition, like different carpet in the house, or that place where a wood floor ends and a carpeted room begins, where you don't have to have that sort of brass, whatever they call that thing in there that you stub your toe on all the time. I don't want there to be a seam between the two. I want to live the same life wherever I am. But when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about tonight, I wrote a sentence that I often try to replicate when I'm beginning the process of a more formal talk. It's just something that I do when you have to, give a fancy talk on weather and climate change and food production in Zambia from my point of view through the work that I'm doing with the UN. I sort of start out with, everything that I learned in Zambia. And it's a starting place to put words on paper. The first words are always the toughest ones, then it sort of flows. But it truly is a fact of my life that everything I learned in recovery. With apologies to the people who heard some of this stuff before, when I sobered up, I was not one of those people that needed to be, by the way, gratefully sober since January 28th, 1992. I didn't need to be rehabilitated. I needed to be habilitated. I truly did not know how to live. I had spent so much of my life as a user of people and taker of things, going back to way before I picked up my first drink or drug. I identified so much, pre-contact with things that affected me from the neck up, with this idea of a giant-sized ego, of the king baby, of self-will run riot, of self-centeredness, of this destructive path of the alcoholic that I read about in our literature when I first came upon it at other attempts at sobriety. I just knew right away that was me. But that was me before I picked up a drink or a drug. The drinks, the drugs, it was part of the evolution. And it was what I thought was a really good solution to my problems. And my problems were my feelings. My problems were my attitudes. And because I did not know how to properly deal with those things, work your way out of a problem, talk to other people, right? My grand sponsor said to me when I was a couple months sober, he pulled me aside at a meeting and he said, Andrew, he said, all those shadows out there in the world, those are other people, and walked away from me. It took me a long time to figure out what he was trying to tell me. But I got the point. I was born and raised in New York City. I came from a family that had more than we could ever need. I was very lucky. Mom, dad, apartment in New York, good school, friends, pets, a second home, sort of an idyllic life and upbringing. But there was something different inside of me. I wanted what I wanted, and I wanted it now. Even some of my earliest memories revolve around things like, or revolved around things that I wanted that I didn't think I was going to get, or protecting turf that I thought I was going to lose. I stole as a little kid, 6, 7 years old, from the corner store in the summer community that I spent time in as a child, and I stole useless things. So we had fishing gear that my dad had in a box and in a couple of holders that broke, that a broken down rod would fit into, so that when we went to go fishing, he could grab all his gear. And we had everything that we needed. Why did I need to steal a bag of 50 cork bobbers? I got into trouble. The police came to that. It was one of those scared straight. Let the 7-year-old kid see a police car. He'll never steal again. Oh my God. It made it so much juicier. I liked the rush of stealing. I liked the idea of getting away with it. I liked the challenge of it, right? Is a cop car going to roll up on me? I don't know. Can I get good at this? Right? And I kept stealing, all the way through, even the day before I started this current sobriety. I was stealing from my best friend and lying to him, the person who rescued me from a hotel after I tried to kill myself. So that is part of who I am. I don't like to say I'm over it. I like to think of it as a period of dormancy inside me, because I truly believe if I pick up a drink or a drug, it will activate a piece of me that I will not only pick up right where I left off with the drugs and alcohol, but I will pick up where I left off with the behaviors that were a part of my life. The stealing, the scheming, the protecting, the compartmentalizing, the outrageous behaviors, the sexualizing of everything, the gambling, all the risk taking will be there for me. I know it will. When I was using, I crossed every moral boundary that you could possibly think of. From stealing drugs from my dying grandmother, to rolling patrons of nightclubs that were seriously hammered as they walked out of a well, there was one nightclub in New York that I had frequented at one point in my life. And then when I was homeless, I would wait across the street. And when I saw someone kind of walking out in a fancy suit, if they went left, they're going to the corner of 17th Street and 8th Avenue. Can't do anything about them. But if they went right, they were actually going to go by one of the few alleys that actually existed on some of our long blocks in New York. The only alleys really that are left in New York are in the sort of Byzantine streets in lower Manhattan. But there was an alley for anyone who turned right out of this nightclub called Area. And I would literally cross the street, push the guy into the alley, trip him, wallet, watch, whatever it was in my hand and gone. And I'm down the street in a flash before this person could do anything. And I knew to steal from people who were completely inebriated. My using started off very, very innocently, taking sips of my father's drinks. I loved it. I loved the taste of scotch. I loved sipping my dad's drink, even though my father thought it was, well, amusing, but said, no, don't do that because my mother would get very upset. My parents divorced when I was 5. My dad would come over to my mother's apartment where I lived a couple times a week to pick up mail and to see me. I dabbled at the edges. I chugged down drinks that my cousins would give me, telling me it was ginger ale when it was really stirred up champagne on ice at, family Thanksgivings, things like that. It was all pretty minimal, the once or twice a year thing, until my mother had an accident in a hospital, cut off the oxygen supply to her brain, and she wound up in a bag, oxygen tent, trying to keep her alive, in a coma for 3 or 4 months, coming out of an operation where they had cut off the oxygen supply to her brain. She lost a large part of her functioning. So she wound up being in the hospital for several months, then in a mental hospital for 2 or 3 years, while I lived in her old apartment with some caregivers, and my father lived in his apartment, which was downtown in the West Village, what is now the West Village of Manhattan. It was a tragic part of my life and a traumatic part of my life to come home from summer camp and find my mother in that kind of horrific state. And I knew right away that I did not want to feel the way I felt. And I knew right away how to not feel what I was feeling. So there were 3 things that I did almost immediately the summer I turned 13. I went with a friend of my older cousins, one of my older cousins, out to the band shell in Central Park and bought a 1/4 pound of weed from a guy named Floyd, who was my on and off drug dealer for a couple of years in 8th, 9th, and 10th grade before I graduated to more sophisticated business practices. Floyd was someone who my cousins bought weed from, and because there were no parents in my house, there was an envelope with cash underneath the silverware caddy in the kitchen. And I knew where it was. So I just took $120, $140, whatever it was at the time, and went out and bought a big bag of weed, sold a bunch to my friends, put the money that I stole back into the envelope because I thought I was such a smarty pants, and had a big pile for myself to smoke. This was 1974 in New York City. So we had a house charge at the liquor store. So I simply called up the liquor store and just did the old, this is the Zimmern house. We need a bottle of Smirnoff and of Dewar's and of Barbancourt rum and, whatever it was that I ordered. And by the way, we had a full bar. It was just really easy to order more alcohol. Within 35, 40 minutes, there was a buzz from the doorman downstairs. Your delivery's on its way up. Bills would come to my house. My father didn't see that much of a ripple in the amounts. He just signed checks and that was it. He was ordering lots of stuff from the liquor store for the house. And And then there was my favorite, which was the family complaint to the local pharmacy. For young people today, you really got to jump through a couple of hoops. It's not impossible to get pharmaceutical drugs, prescription drugs to abuse. And obviously you can buy them. Pill use these days is really out of control. But it was so easy in those days to call down and say, hi, the pharmacist picks up, my mom's not able to sleep and she's in the shower and she asked me to call down for more of her sleep aid or whatever it was. I mean, we were getting, White Cross, we were getting Placidils and Quaaludes before they became more heavily regulated, just by calling the pharmacist, because they simply served the needs of the family. I mean, this in the mid 1970s. So before, I was into ninth grade, I was, a weekly user of hallucinogenics, a daily user of cocaine, marijuana, pills, alcohol. By the time I was in 11th grade, I added heroin to the mix. And so by the time I got to college, I was a highly accomplished New York City garbage head. I did very well in high school. How, I do not know. I should have gotten kicked out a couple of times, but I went to a fancy private school and they brought your parents in and your parents made a donation to the school or reminded the school that, we had been there for 2 generations and they were like, just graduate the kid, get him out of here. I started to have real trouble when I got to college. Growing up in New York, in the city, we did a lot of drugs. We didn't really drink a lot, right? We went to Trader Vic's on weekends, but when I got to college, I met people who was the exact opposite. I mean, they smoked a little weed, but I arrived at school with a half ounce of cocaine in my bag, and I was worried, how long would it last me? And when would I have to take the train and go back down to New York to get more? Who was I going to set up business with? Me and my best friend dealt drugs in my high school. So I was like, I just need to figure out the rules of the road here before I set up business at my college. And they were the exact opposite. They could tolerate drink pretty well, but were new to drugs or just dabbling. And so before day 1 of class, I was hospitalized with alcohol poisoning. I had never consumed fruit punch that had Everclear in it. I mean, I'd never tried it. I mean, who knew, right? I mean, we didn't. So, I woke up one day in the hospital, and part of the deal with the college that I went to was I had to go to a drug assessment. I went to a drug assessment, and I met a guy named D.B. Brown. D.B. Brown, I mean, if I saw him today, I could pick him out of a lineup anywhere. Old hippie, long hair, beard, super smart, beautiful voice, great man. His job was to help kids, right? But like everyone who had tried to help me, judges, shrinks, teachers, any teachers in here? Couple. It took me forever to realize that teachers take their jobs because they want to help young people achieve their dreams, right? I had teachers who cared about me, who I told to go blank themselves because I thought they were the enemy. Everyone was the enemy, right? But I ignored the advice from everybody. And I ignored the advice that D.B. Brown gave me. He asked me a couple of questions, talked to me for a while, left the room, came back with some written work for me to do, talked with me for about another half an hour, and then said, well, good news is you're here and talking to me. He said, but I've got bad news for you. And I said, what's that? By the way, I just turned 18 the previous summer. And it was like the 3rd day of class, freshman year. And he said, you're chronic on the Jellinek scale, which is a mechanism named after a gentleman named Dr. Jelinek, who came up with a chart that was a very quick but very reliable assessment of sort of where you were in your alcoholism and addiction. And I was chronic at age 18. Scale of 1 to 10, I'm a 10. And like so many other stories, I just told him to go screw himself and kept using. And he had told me, he was the first person who told me this was a progressive disease. It doesn't get better, it only gets worse. He was the first person to tell me that alcoholics and drug addicts who are chronic, they wind up in jails and institutions and then dead. He told me all the things that I later found out to be true. Had I just listened to D.B. Brown, but I was not interested at age 18 in any opinion, in anything any of you had to say, because I knew better myself about everything. And I mean everything. I never uttered the words, I don't know how to do blank, can you help me, until I was in my 30s. Never said the words. Never said the words. I made my way into, somehow I graduated. I was asked to take 3 different semesters off. Somehow I graduated, became one of those classic examples of hyper responsibility and hyper irresponsibility in New York, where I had this secret life. There I would be in blackouts for 2 or 3 days using, and then I would be at work crushing it and making a name for myself in the New York City restaurant world of the 80s. I was a rock star chef in a Michelin-starred restaurant. I managed restaurants. I had partnerships in restaurants, all in my 20s. I was very talented. And the whole time I was snorting speedballs because I had figured out that I could work and work really well on a combination of cocaine and heroin, as long as I wasn't shooting and I was just snorting. And that sort of became my sort of go-to thing throughout the 80s. Little by little, I stopped being the funny guy that told stories, and I started being the guy that my friends called and said, dude, what you did last night scared me. And I'd be like, what did I do? I didn't even remember. I became the angry drunk, not the funny drunk. I became the guy that would pick fights. I became the guy that would, push my friend's girlfriend into a closet and grope her. I was the guy who would disappear after his grandmother had passed away for 3 days, and found with a needle in his arm in the bathroom of a Japanese restaurant by the police, which is how my parents found out, having missed my grandmother's funeral, the woman who taught me how to cook. And because of those things, I started to get some pretty large consequences. Loss of respect from friends was just the beginning. People didn't want to hang out with me, right? Inability to maintain a job, getting fired from jobs. Earlier on, I held on to jobs because my skill set in the kitchen or out on the floor was good enough where they were like, look, we know this guy's stealing from us. We know he's a mess, right? But man, he's the only guy that can put out 400 eggs at brunch, right? And by the way, if anyone here cooks, in New York City, in a place that's doing 600 covers at brunch and 300 of them are poached egg dishes, if you can put out all those poached eggs in a 2-hour period, you can be doing whatever you want there. You are the MVP of that restaurant. You will be working brunch for the rest of your life. Same thing with risotto in Italian restaurants. You get 2 burners, there's 5 risottos on the menu. How are you going to do that? They each take 40 minutes. You can pull that off. They're never firing you. I had worked in Italy for 6 months at a Michelin-star restaurant at a risotto station, right? I picked jobs where I became indispensable. And, but even those people started to catch on to me and fired me. So little by little, I slipped to the edges of society, rented a apartment for $50 a month up in a probably the most dangerous neighborhood in New York City at the time, and purposely got the apartment, picked this one apartment, and put my bed against the window so I could literally flash hand signs to the gang members sitting on the stoop in that building, so they would run drugs up to my apartment. I didn't even have to leave in inclement weather. By the way, an apartment so dangerous, it looked like the apartment at the end of Serpico when Frank Serpico gets shot. It was not unusual to be stepping over dead bodies on the landings of the floors as I walked up to the third floor where my apartment was. And I thought that was just normal living. I wound up getting evicted from my apartment on 44th Street that I had conned my father into helping me with, and showed up by the sheriff of New York. I did not know there was a sheriff of New York. There is. He handles evictions and is kept very busy doing just that. And I got evicted from my apartment, and I went down to the Shot in a Beer bar that only closes for a half an hour to hose the place down on the backside of the old Port Authority in New York City, a bar I don't recommend anyone ever go into if it still exists. I'm assuming it doesn't. And I had my duffel bag. I was allowed to carry one bag out. And guys looked at me and said, "What happened? You get evicted?" And by the way, when I say the guys, I mean the guys in the bottle gang from the alley that when they stole enough money or got, or begged it, went inside to this bar to do their drinking, right? And there was an old toothless guy. He was probably 30. He looked 90. His name was AJ, another face I'll never forget. AJ said, "We're squatting a building down on Sullivan Street. If you want to sleep there tonight, you can." I said, "Okay." And so I went down. I had nowhere else to go. No friends would have me. I wasn't going to ask anybody, "Hey, what would you do?" Because they would have said something like, "Well, you can go to the Salvation Army, or you can go to a place and ask for help." I mean, God forbid I do that. The problem was not me. The problem was you people, right? You ripped me off the last time I bought drugs from you. You fired me. You told my girlfriend I was using. I mean, it was you. Blamed everybody but myself. So I lived for 13 months in an abandoned building on Sullivan Street where we pirated the electricity. There were casements in the windows, no glass, no frames. It was freezing cold in the winter. It was blazing hot in the summer. And I slept on a pile of dirty clothes, stealing a bottle of Comet cleanser every other day from the local bodega. Loved stealing. And I would sprinkle it in a pile, in a circle around the pile of dirty clothes that were in that bag that I had brought to that Shot and Beer bar to talk to AJ. And I would sprinkle the Comet cleanser around my pile of dirty clothes so that every night when I passed out, not went to sleep, passed out, the rats and roaches wouldn't crawl over me. I stole purses off of outdoor restaurant seats and sometimes indoor restaurant seats to support my habits. I would shred the contents of the purse that wasn't valuable, pocket the cash, sell the credit card, sell the passport. If I got a passport, you got $25 for a passport down in Alphabet City. And I just had been drinking exclusively then. I gave up drugs because drugs were bad. Things got a lot worse when I was just drinking. And I wound up, long story short, deciding there were winners and losers in life. I was a loser. Went and stole some jewelry from my grandmother, Hockett, New Jersey. Came back to New York City, plunked $100 down at the San Pedro Motel that rented rooms only by the hour. Asked them to hold my calls, and went upstairs, shoved a fistful of barbiturates down my throat, drank a half bottle of Popov vodka. I will never forget that vodka. They had just come out with plastic bottles. And I remember when I bought it to go upstairs to the room at the hotel, the guy put the 2 bottles in a bag, and I grabbed it, and it was like, what? It was so light. I opened it up, and, you know, as if maybe they were saying missing, and the guy behind the counter just looked at me and went, plastic bottles. They'll think of everything these days. I went upstairs and tried to kill myself. Woke up 2 days later and did the thing that I had never done before, which was I called my best friend, the person who I thought would take my call no matter what. I was right. He's an angel in my life. And I said, I don't know what to do. Can you help me? And he said, where are you? And I told him, and he was there 20 minutes later, got me out of that hotel, and took me to his house to dry me out. Wound up planning my intervention. I don't know, it was probably my 10th. I had been, by the way, in jail and in prison. I had been there was no drunk tank in New York. There was just Bellevue, a psych ward. So I'd been to the psych ward 25 times, probably more. Dozens of attempts at sobriety, a couple of outpatient treatments, a few inpatient treatments. And when I, quote unquote, was drying out at Clark's house, I was stealing his alcohol from underneath the sink where he had a box where he kept his little normie bar. So when friends came over, he could put out a couple of bottles. Drained all of that, started hustling him, stealing money from him, telling him I wanted to borrow $5,000 so I could get on with my life. And for some reason did not really catch on when he said, just go have a cup of coffee with Pamela, friend of ours, who I knew had just gotten sober. I was like, fine, because I thought this is my quick route to getting money from Clark. And I went and had a cup of coffee with Pamela 3 days outside of that San Pedro motel stay. And I walked into a room of 20 people and I just said, what time's my airplane? I mean, I knew what was happening. And, but what really got me, and the reason why I'm standing here today, I think in no small part, is not because of who was at my intervention, but who wasn't at my intervention. My mother, my father, my 2 or 3 closest friends other than Clark, and my fiance, not there. Didn't want to get hurt, couldn't be bothered, didn't want to have anything to do with me. I had created a situation in my life where my parents thought I was dead because they hadn't heard boo from me in 2 years. So when my friends called them and said, we're doing an intervention for Andrew, we found him, he was alive, they said, we don't want to see him. I'm a parent now. What would it take for me to be so hurt that I couldn't handle seeing my child again for fear I was going to get hurt more? What would that take? I'm not able to comprehend that. And yet that was a fact of my life with my parents who loved me and were despite their own individual problems, smart people I respected, people with a lot of compassion and love in their hearts. And that floored me. That floored me, that I had sunk to those depths, and alienated those people. And I went and got on my plane and I flew to Center City, and spent 5 days on the medical unit at Hazelden. And the rest, as they say, is history. And that was 12,070 days ago. Now, I will tell you, along the way, some pretty incredible things happened to me. The first one was I was convinced that recovery was for all of you and not for me, just like everything else in life. I was so cynical. I was so angry. I was so bitter at the world. I was convinced I was still a loser. And I read in all the literature, and I listened to the lectures, and I read in the book how the most important thing in establishing real recovery, sobriety, not just being dry, but being sober, was to develop a relationship with a power greater than yourself. Can be anything. Get to choose whatever you want it to be. Doesn't have to be God. It could be the Great Spirit. It could be the doorknob. It could be the group. It could be the lamppost. It didn't matter. But you had to think something was bigger than you. Well, number one, despite being pretty beaten down, I mean, I have a hard time imagining being more beaten down than I was at that point. I wrote over and over and over in my notebook, I don't want to hurt anyone anymore. I don't want to hurt anyone anymore. Hopeless, hopeless, hopeless. I just want to be happy. I just want to be happy. It was like Jack Nicholson, The Shining. I mean, literally, my original notebook from my last treatment. I still have it. I still look at it. And a friend pointed out that there's a past tense promise at the beginning of the 12th step that says, having had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. And I realized then and there, as he explained it to me, that I didn't have to have a white light spiritual experience. I didn't have to have some momentous thing happen to me that all of a sudden catapulted me into the fourth dimension of existence, as Bill Wilson describes in his story, lying in the hospital bed, talking to Ebby Thatcher. But in fact, if I just put one foot in front of the other and worked the steps of my 12-step program, I would have a spiritual awakening. Oh my God. That night, there was a guy speaking on the stage at Bigelow Auditorium about this size, that everyone from the treatment center and outside guests would come in and listen to a speaker every evening at the treatment center I was in. And I walked up to him afterwards. I liked him. I wanted what he had. He seemed cool. He told some funny stories. He seemed to have his you-know-what together. And I just walked up to him and I said, I need a sponsor. Would you be my sponsor? He said, do you even know what a sponsor is? And I said, sort of, but not really. Kind of had a few in New York at different times, but never really listened. And I was high as hell in all those meetings. And he gave me his number and said, if you come down to St. Paul, call me. And as luck would have it, I was accepted at the halfway house that Hazelin runs in St. Paul. I called him, and for 32 and a half years, he was my sponsor until he passed away at the end of last July in his 80s. His sobriety date was a week ago. He would have had 48 years. And he lived a life. He left, when he sobered up, he left his law firm and did little private real estate legal stuff to pay his bills. He took his money from his last divorce, bought a couple of little buildings in St. Paul, like little townhouses, and rented apartments to people who needed them, and set up his life so that he had just enough mailbox money to live decently, take 1 or 2 trips a year, and literally be of service in Alcoholics Anonymous 24/7, 365. I really lucked out meeting Jim Linden. He and a bunch of other quote unquote old timers in St. Paul got me pretty plugged into AA service right away. And service changed my life. When I was talking to someone else when I was mopping a floor, when I was making coffee, when I was going with other people on a 12-step call, or going to a drunk tank to talk to people or share my experience at 1 month, 2 months, 6 months, 8 months, a year, didn't matter. I was never thinking of me and my problems. It was literally like drinking to me. I mean, that's how I described it to other people. It was the time when I was not obsessing with my problems, and I was actually thinking clearly, and I actually felt happy and useful. And all I wanted to be in life was to be happy. Very sort of selfish thought, but it was my thought. Wrote it over and over in that book. The longer I stayed dry and then became sober, the less I hurt people. I still hurt people today. Doesn't happen very often. I live a life where I am very much able to practice restraint of pen and tongue, as the book says, and I am able to put a space between my thoughts and my actions. So do I hurt people? Yeah, of course I do. Mostly those closest to me. Kids, wife, right? Friends, people you have real contact with, people who work for me. And when I do, it's usually when I'm moving too fast, or when I haven't been to a meeting in a day or two, and I'm just, I go on rapid fire. But most of the time, I'm pretty good about it. Service changed my life. I started working in a restaurant, became the chef and partner in the restaurant. Went to a lot of meetings, started sponsoring a lot of guys, and I was 6, 7 years sober. And I happened to be looking at a medallion one day, and I was doing local television and doing bit parts on a couple of early first-gen HGTV shows that were shot in the Twin Cities, where they needed someone to come on and do a cooking demo. One was called Rebecca's Garden. It was an old gardening show that was syndicated. Another one was a tipster show called Typical Mary Ellen, that premiered on year 1 of HGTV. And eventually some producer said, we ought to do food tips. We're running out of things for Mary Ellen to talk tips about, and she didn't cook. So I became the house chef on this show. I got $50 a day, which was massively big money back then. I saw this medallion, and it said patience, tolerance, and understanding around it. A lot of medallions have different sayings around the perimeter of one side or another. And I thought the world was being very impatient, intolerant, and less understanding of other people from other places. I have a very strong civics bred backbone from my liberal parents, and I marched for every cause that they believed in the 60s, and then a lot that I believed in the 70s and 80s. And I thought to myself, wow, what if we had I need to figure out a TV show of my own. How would I want to express patience, tolerance, and understanding for other people? Well, I want to make people curious about patience, tolerance, and understanding. So instead of doing a show, and I want to travel. So instead of doing a show about like steak au poivre in Paris, what about like eating the rats that live in the sewers of Paris with people who still practice rodent eating in one of the world's most glamorous cities? What if I went to, Pampanga in the Philippines, where they still are a bug-eating culture and ate bugs? What if I ate the foods that were off the grid and visited with families and people where one man's weird was another man's wonderful, but it was really a Trojan horse to get me to talk about patience, tolerance, and understanding? Because if I do it on a channel that's distributed worldwide, wow, that would just be too crazy. But if it worked out, I could show people in Finland what people in Uruguay do for dinner and vice versa. And that show became Bizarre Foods. I pitched it, people liked it, I refined it, I shot a 5-minute pilot, a 10-minute pilot, then we actually made a pilot. The third episode that aired got me on the Jay Leno show. The ratings exploded. They put a guy named Tony Bourdain, who just had a brand new show on that network as well, called No Reservations. They put us on the same night, said, Travel Channel was a tiny little cable station. They said, well, let's put these two shows on the same night. And for anyone that ever watched Travel Channel for the 5-6 years that we were on the same night before they moved him to Tuesday and started to build other shows down the rest of the week, that was must-see TV at the time. And it changed my life because I had a platform through which I could do things. I was able to make a difference in the world in the big ways that I always wanted to, because I had learned long ago from you people that I didn't just have to practice service work with other alcoholics. When I sobered up, I got a 3rd edition of our big book. And at the bottom of page 84, it talks about what to do if you're resentful, angry, jealous, or afraid. And it has a prescription to take 4 action steps. One of those action steps is to do service work. It does not say service work for another alcoholic. I always misread it, always. And at a big book study, someone pointed out to me, why do you keep saying you're like reading words that aren't there? It's just that every time I saw service words for other alcoholics, it just says, do something for another human being, I think is actually the how it's written. He said, you can push chairs in at your office. You can pick up the phone and call your mother and just tell her you love her, right? You can empty someone's garbage bag, right? You can pull the garbage can up from the bottom of the driveway for the person down the street who's a little elderly and doesn't walk as well as they used to, right? Doesn't have to be a grand gesture. It can be saying little, do something for another human being. And I realized that I had the opportunity to do some big things on a bigger stage for bigger people, for bigger causes that I believed in. And so that effort of creating a TV show predicated on patience, tolerance, and understanding became the bottom of a pyramid that I built for myself with lots of other shows, lots of other work that I was doing, books, all those nice things that were read when I was introduced, became the vehicle for me to make real change in the world that I wanted to see. And it's where I focus most of my time today. A couple of things that I learned while doing that I wanted to sort of close with. And these really are the sort of the nuts and bolts of how I live today, but they're also the biggest lessons that I've been able to glean from this last half of my life. I'm 63, sober for 33 years. So I'm finally sober longer than I was alive before that. And I only used for 14, 15 years. But keeping my mouth shut. And I was talking earlier and somebody asked me about how I keep my mouth shut. And I wanted to save some good stuff for this talk. The big one for me is I'd always say to my sponsor, please talk to me like I'm 4 years old and I don't understand what you're saying. I mean, just please, because I don't get how to do this stuff. I actually need an instruction manual, right? Needed to be habilitated, not rehabilitated. And my sponsor told me, every time you open your mouth, you ask yourself these questions. Is it true? If it's true, does it need to be said? And if it's true and it needs to be said, is it up to you to say it? And it's that last one that gets me every single time, because a lot of the times it's true and it does need to be said. It ain't up to me to say it. In so many different ways, in so many different places. I do not need to deliver every message to my kid because my ego says I want to be father of the year. And I don't need to tell my wife things that are not true just because I want the get out of jail free card and everything in between. Is it true? Does it need to be said? And if it's true, it needs to be said. Is it up to you, up to me to say it? Second thing, I was a user of people and a taker of things, and every time I opened up my mouth, I lied. And yes, I'm using a really, really, really childish example, but when someone says, "How you doing?" to me today, I actually tell them how I'm doing, even if it's a stranger. Because I used to always lie about it, and I don't want to lie about it. I don't want to live in that place anymore. I do not need, full disclosure is not always necessary, but if the cab driver says to me when I'm leaving the airport and going home, "How's your day going?" I will say to him, "Shitty. I feel guilty. I've been away for a long, I haven't been home, and my kid's having a tough day, so it ain't great." And then he'll say to me, "Oh, me too. I work 2 jobs. I drive this cab at night. My kids don't get it." And all of a sudden I'm talking to another dad about taking care of our families. I'm not isolated in the back of a cab sitting there on my phone, right? How do I not lie? How do I learn to tell the truth? I needed to come up with something in my head. And what I came up with is this. The truth should not be option 5. For me, for this alcoholic, when you ask me, "Hey, what's going on?" the first thing that is going to come out of my mouth is a lie that's going to tell you something pretty grandiose and cool. I was just at the Super Bowl sitting in between John Batiste and Bill Belichick. What an awful thing to tell someone. Is that a good way to connect? That's ridiculous, right? Here's the messed up part for someone who does what I do. I was sitting at the Super Bowl in between Bill Belichick and John Batiste. I'm on the board of an NFL charity. That was the ticket that I got, right? But it's a piece of the truth. My bigger truth of my Super Bowl experience was terrible game, but I got to take my stepkid. That's really the truth. But I want to tell you something grandiose. Sometimes it's the truth, but I'm probably going to stretch it a little bit. I stop myself these days, but even at 15 years sober, I would stretch the truth, right? Lead you to believe something that wasn't the case, because I needed my ego stroke. I needed to feel better about me, right? Because I didn't have the kit of spiritual tools fully developed, sufficient to which I could just live being me. And if you didn't like it, okay, right? But I had to keep reminding myself the truth should not be option 5. And there is usually a universal truth inside of me that is more representative of what my experience was than something else, right? Lots of truths about my day-to-day, right? Probably the biggest takeaway still, can't believe I'm the last speaker in this series. Someone's got to take this thing over. There's got to be some other sober person around here. What other people think of me is none of my business. Pure and simple. I do not care what you think of me. If I'm living right-sized, and it's why I still go to a lot of meetings every week, I still work the steps, I still sponsor people, I am working on getting a new sponsor because Jim would kill me if I didn't have a sponsor. It's really hard at 33 years. I've had someone since like day 13 up until year basically 33. Nightmare. What if it's not the right person? I actually said that to someone. They laughed, one of my sponsees, actually one of my great grand sponsees, and he laughed at me. Because I mean, what a ludicrous thing. Just pick someone, for gosh sake. But what other people think of me is none of my business. One of the greatest things I've ever learned. As alcoholics, drug addicts, gambling addicts, overeaters, undereaters, sex addicts, I am a member, I should tell you, I'm a member of 3 different fellowships, but I primarily am in recovery in Alcoholics Anonymous. We have huge egos. We're all about self-centeredness, right? Self-will run riot. And we're pretty unhappy. What does the book say? An alcoholic in his cups is a unhappy. I mean, it's just one of those jilted sort of written in the 30s lines that always like make some people uncomfortable when they read the literature. But it's true, we're very unhappy. So I think I shared with you, I always wanted just to be happy. I'm not happy every day, but I'm happy a lot of the time. And it has nothing to do with the things. It has to do with my relationships and my quality of life as I live it with you people, right? I had the chance to meet an amazing woman who writes a lot of self-help books, who teaches at the University of Texas, and I adore everything this woman writes about. Her name is Dr. Brene Brown. And I was on a panel with her. I would encourage you to read her books. They're phenomenal. But I had a chance to talk to her once at an event. And she said, oh my gosh, I'm a big fan of yours and all the rest of it. I was like, oh my God, you know who I am? You're Brene Brown. I've read everything you've written. And I asked her a question, which made her laugh because she'd actually written the answer to this question in one of her books that I had read. She said, everyone wants to be happy. If you want to be happy, you have to live in pure empathy. You have to be purely empathic. Well, good luck being purely anything. And I left that conversation completely worse off than when it started. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't even know. I had to look up in a dictionary, the dictionary definition of empathy. And what's fascinating to me is after doing a little bit of like typical research in it and talking to people and saying, I don't know what empathy is. Can you help me understand it? I began to understand the kind of compassion that empathy is made from. And it turns out we all know, most of us do, even if you don't have one, you have a friend who has one. There is a purely empathic creature in most of our lives, and that's your dog. Dogs are pure empathy. Even Hitler had a dog. Hitler would do the worst things in the world. Come home, his dog would jump in his lap, lick him, nuzzle him. Hitler's dog loved Hitler. Bad luck, he went up in the bunker, with the wife and everyone else, but even Hitler had a dog. Dog loved him. Dogs are pure empathy. All they want to do is lay their head in their lap and be with you. The attitude that I try to walk through in life is to be the dog. Just be with people, hear people. And I'll give you a really good example of it. My first wife came home from work one day like a tornado, angry, buzzing all over the place, swearing, slamming doors. I lost my phone. I don't know where my briefcase is. Blah, 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 blah. And I literally stopped her and I said, did you call the security guy in your office building? And she just stopped in her tracks and she said, I'm 42 years old. I run a division at a big Fortune 500 company. I have 2 degrees. Of course I called she's like, screw you. And I'm like, trying to be helpful. And she looked at me, she says, I don't want your help. I am a fully functioning woman. I know exactly what I'm doing. I want my husband to act like my friend and just listen to me. I was like, oh my God. So and then years later, we got to role play this out. She comes home, does the exact same thing, buzzing, freaking everything. And I said, babe, sit down. Let me get you a glass of water. And I come over and I sit down next to her. I'm like, that sounds terrible. Tell me more. Oh my God. I said, well, of course, I called the guy at the security thing. I go, I left my number. Hopefully someone calls and they found it. She's calmer. I'm calmer. I'm the dog. I'm the dog. Be the dog. I learned in Alcoholics Anonymous, I don't need to be the best at anything. My application for that at work, I can be the only. I can be the only. I learned that making bizarre foods. No one else was eating fermented walrus anus. I won an Emmy for that. The last thing that that is really important, because I think it's a really great example of how I continue to unite my worlds and have that area be as smooth as a putting green. My old sponsor, Jim, was really fond of celebrating the miracle of the mundane. Walk the grandchild to the bus stop, get up in the morning and feed the dog, right? The little daily activities. If you can't get joy from them, you're screwed, because life is made up of all those little activities. So when COVID hit and things were really bad, I tried to think of the most mundane TV show that I could think of. Wound up winning, I won my second Emmy for that show. It's called Family Dinner. And the premise of that, no Trojan horse, I literally called up the head of the network and I said, I think we can deliver, I have a production company. I said, I think we can deliver a show in COVID, because if the families are isolated and we test them, and we have a crew that isolates and we test them, we could shoot an entire show over one meal in someone's house. And she's like, what's the show again? And I said, I ring a doorbell at the beginning and I have dinner with a family. And then at the end, we sort of toast. I don't leave. We just sort of experience this thing together. I'm calling it Family Dinner. And she looked at me, she says, that is the most simplistic, dumbest TV show I have ever heard of. How many can you make? What's the budget? And we went and made it for 4 or 5 years until Magnolia stopped doing food. And it was a great show. Trying to celebrate these little jewels that I've learned in recovery about the miracle of the mundane wound up being a great business success of mine. And the reason that I like to mention those kinds of things about how this has played out in my life, it's not just because I get to be the same person on air, off air, just one human being, but that we can be true to ourselves. We can live our truth. The truth does not have to be option 5. We can, in fact, live by the set of principles 24/7, 365, even in our work lives. When we don't think we can, especially if we're willing to look another person in the eye and say, I've got this idea, I need to do this, I don't know how, can you help me? I don't know how, can you help me? Thank you very much, everybody. It was great to spend the night with you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Andrew. We've got a few minutes for questions.
Questions?
So here's the way it's going to work. If you
Did
raise
someone
your
say
hand,
questions?
we'll get a microphone to you for the benefit of people who are listening on Zoom.
By the way, it was very nice to be invited here to tell you one kind of story, but if you want, you can ask me any question that you want about some other part of my life, public or private. It's all open for for business.
Here's the first question.
Oh my gosh.
It says, Andrew, you and Anthony Bourdain were both influential figures in the culinary world, each with your own unique approach to exploring and sharing global cuisines. Could you share how close you were to Anthony and how his passing affected you personally and professionally?
We were very close. He was the most magnetic human being I've ever met. Just a gem of a human, whip smart, super funny, knew so much about everything. I woke up, I was shooting a Philadelphia episode of Zimmern List. We had been shooting late the night before, and so we didn't have, our start time was like 11 a.m. call time in the lobby. So I had my alarm set for like 10 a.m. And alarm goes off, and I hit the phone, and I slide out of bed, and I do my little normal routine thing for a couple minutes, and my phone went back on with an alert. And then I noticed there was like 474 emails, and just like, I mean, I'm like, what the? And I leaned over and I grabbed my phone, and my immediate reaction was, my child is dead. Why else would that many? Before I saw a message or an email, I'm just like, what is going on? And then literally, like, whatever, the 15th report from whatever, the LA Times, you know, with some new news about the Bourdain death. And I was stunned. And yet at the same time, a part of me wasn't stunned. And I called our director, producer, who was on location with me. And he said, his first words were, "I'm so sorry. I know how close you were. I'm just going to give everyone the day off, and and I was like, nope. I said, I can't sit and do this in Phil. Like, maybe if I was home, I could, spend time with, I said, I got to work. Number one, take my mind off it. Number two, the show must go on. Number three, he'd want it that way. Number four, I had all these reasons. And it wound up being I wore some shoes that he had given me as a gift. I wound up doing a lot of radio and TV stuff. CNN put a truck up we were shooting this restaurant that night to close out the day of shooting. CNN brought a truck up there, and I did all the nighttime news shows on CNN because they wanted to talk to friends of his to put it in perspective. But at that point, there was so much we didn't know. Professionally, he's left a huge gap, a huge hole in our industry. Personally, I think it made me really determined to not sleep on my mental health issues that I was lazier about before he died than I am now. And the reason is, I will make a mistake at work that will affect other people negatively. I will forget something at home or not do something my wife told me to do, whatever. She gets mad, yells at me, all with good reason. I will take a job because I think I need the money. And my son will say something like, "Oh, great, another night you're not home." And I'm walking down the street thinking, I'm a terrible boss. I'm a bad friend. I'm a shitty husband. I'm failing as a father. And I just start to spiral out of control. And a car goes by, and it's like the cheerleaders from the University of Minnesota with their pom-poms screaming, "We love you, Andrew Zimmern. You're the best. We love you." And all you think to yourself is, me? No way. If you only knew me, you would not love me. And that, by definition, is the textbook example of what they call the imposter syndrome. And I've been way more diligent about my own mental health issues since his passing. His issues were very complex. It's not my story to tell, but I guess since I've been asked before, I can say all the books I read, all the biopics, they like Roadrunner and that other stuff, get 99% of all that stuff. They get his life right, they just don't get his death right. So human beings are very complex, and he is at peace now, and I wish that he was still around.
Who's next? If you would raise your hand if you have a question.
Shout it out.
How do you handle all?
Tom, just 1 second. Let me get you, because the people at home can't hear you. You gonna get to him, Casey?
Oh, we got people at home.
We got Zoomers.
Zoomers.
Hello, everybody. I haven't talked to the microphone for a while, but how do you deal with all the dinners, all the places you've been where they serve alcohol? How do you finesse that?
I don't drink it.
You just say you don't drink?
No, thank you. I mean, more insidious, and I hope this isn't oversharing, on camera or at a dinner party or at someone's house, they pour wine. People serve alcohol everywhere. I keep alcohol in my house. I keep alcohol in all 3 of our refrigerators. I have a couple of dented ones in the garage, like other people with lots of kids for the extra stuff that you have to do. And then I have a freezer because I'm a chef, and an extra refrigerator because I'm a chef. And I do a lot of shooting at my house. We serve wine in our home. We entertain a lot. Do a lot of fundraisers at our house. We entertain a lot. I have cases of wine and booze and beer at my house. I don't drink it. I never think about it. Literally never think about it, because my experience has been, now, by the way, I would not have done that at 5 or 10 years sober. But at this stage in my life, I do all the things I'm supposed to do: meeting, steps, sponsors, sponsees, service work, all that stuff that, as the promises say, it's removed from me. When I'm on a set and someone, I mean, the cliche, but I've been there. I mean, I shot a whole bunch of shows in Russia. Vodka on the table, glasses, iced up, cheers, we're going to drink this whole bottle together. I'm like, no, can't. Eventually, I just tell them I'm allergic. I can't. Sometimes I say, I just don't drink anymore. I mean, you just say it, and it's okay. More insidious is where, in the times in my sobriety where I've been somewhere I'm not supposed to be. So when the people from the French tourism office that you have to shoot TV with on the final day, like, come, we're going to do a dinner and we're going to go to a nightclub and it's going to be fun. I'm tired. I want to go home, but I want to be the good guy, and I want them to like me. And I'm a people pleaser, and I have codependency streaks so big up my back. If I took off my shirt, you could see them, right? And I'm like, okay. And I'm like, oh, this is just dumb. Why didn't I just say I'm going to go home to the hotel? and dinner goes okay, it's fine. And then we go to this, and everyone is saying, oh, just come to the thing with us. And some of the guys are like, if we drink, you could drive the van home. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'll drive the van home. But I'm not telling my truth, which is, love you guys, you're gonna have to find someone else. I gotta go back to the hotel. For me, I gotta go back to the hotel, but I don't do it. And then I wind up with this like stunning woman on the dance floor, right? Dancing. And then she's got her friends, and I'm the guy on TV, right? And my show airs over there, and they're telling me how much they love me, right? And all of a sudden, I have a whole other agenda in my head. And then one of them, like turning around, takes a joint from someone else, turns around and goes to kiss me and tries to shotgun the joint down my throat. And there was a voice inside my head that said, thank you, God. This is going to be the best night of my life. And I was like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix. I mean, I don't know how I did it, but I'm like completely horizontal on the floor, bent at the knees, like, whoa. That's how my disease shows up when I'm not on top of my game. And I think that happens to all of us. That's the stuff that worries me, it's those other little things where I show up. I know this sounds really weird, and I'm not a religious person. I'm also a Jew from New York. So when I say stuff like, that's how the devil shows up in my life, it's kind of a weird thing coming out of my mouth, but that's how like the devil shows up in my life. That's my disease.
We got time for one more.
What's the most bizarre foods you ever eat, like in pounds?
In volume? Wow. Never heard about it in volume. The worst, I get asked all the time about the worst things that I've ever eaten, right? And it's always the rotten and fermented foods, things that are left to rot for so long that if you ate them at a month old, they'd kill you. But at 6 months old, the good bacteria eats the bad bacteria. All the rot and the stink is left, but it's like healthy for you. It's nutraceutical at that point, like grandma's sauerkraut, but with like organ meat. 6 months old, just left. But a couple of them have been so good, I have feasted on them. And while the volume was small, I ate 10 times more fermented whale oil with an Athabascan tribal family in way northern Alaska, where they let the whale fat ferment, let it rot, and then they render it. And you dip little pieces of dried whitefish in it, which you need the fat to moisten the dried whitefish, because the dried whitefish is inedible. It's like eating styrofoam. There's no, like it would suck up every bit of saliva. So you have to put this fat in there. And I tried it and I was like, God, that's awful, but it's like so good. I want to try that again. And the Athabascan grandmother is like, that's enough. And I was like, oh, I've crossed some sort of politeness thing, because they just had a little cup of it. I was like, oh, they must not have a lot of fermented whale oil. They had 5 gallons of it in the back. They have a limitless supply of this stuff. But I misread the whole thing. And my director comes out and he's like, we need to get another shot of him. So Andrew, we need to get a close-up of you. So take another bite. Oh, videographer says, oh, there's a sun flare coming through the window. Let me run around the other side. I'm going to go outside and shoot it through the window. And we're going to get this really arty shot. Take one more. Oh, take another bite. Oh, I dribbled on my, better take another bite. So I had like 7, 8 bites of this stuff. And the Athabascan grandmother only told me once. That's why I love the first peoples of the Arctic, because they have a way of, they're not going to tell you something twice. And if you get in trouble, it's like, we told you. It's like, well, you need to tell me like 5 times, like back home. Like, no. So it turns out if you eat too much of this stuff, the reason that they eat it isn't because it allows you to eat the dried fish. It's that it raises your body temperature a lot. The putrefied whale oil, your body has such an insane reaction to it. It basically, you get a fever from it. So they low grade fever, so you warm up, right? It's 35 degrees below zero outside in the middle of the day. That's the high temperature, okay? So I basically pass out sweating, and they carry me outside, strip all my clothes off, I'm in my underwear, and they carry me outside to basically lay me in the snow, cool my body off, rush me back in to warm me up so I don't die. Because the whale oil is so powerful. And that's why she said, don't eat, you're fine, twice, that's it, done. I never ignored a grandmother telling me what to do over a meal ever since then. So while it's not a lot of food, it was a lot of fermented whale oil. Always listen to the Athabascan grandmothers. It's the moral of that story.
Let's give him another round of applause. There are 2 things. Don't forget, next week, same time as tonight, a different speaker. But for the next 30 minutes, we have a professional photographer that will take photos of you with Andrew Zimmern if you'd like. So you don't have to leave, but the line forms over there. Raise your hand. Yeah. All right. Thank you all for coming.
Really nice to meet you.
Thank you.
Hey,
Nice.